The House will be in order. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks on and include extraneous material on the bill H.R. 1526.
Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to House Resolution 351 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of H.R. 1526. The Chair appoints the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall, to preside over the Committee of the Whole.
The House is in the Committee of the Whole on the State of the Union for consideration of H.R. 1526, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill to restore employment and educational opportunities in and improve the economic stability of counties containing National Forest System land, while also reducing Forest Service management costs by ensuring that such counties have a dependable source of revenue from National Forest System land, to provide a temporary extension of the Secure Rural Schools and Community Self-Determination Act of 2000, and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the bill is considered read the first time. The gentleman from Washington, Mr. Hastings, the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. DeFazio, will each control 30 minutes. The House will come to order. The Chair would ask all members to please take their seats and take their conversations from the floor. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, the committee is not in order.
The committee is not in order. The gentleman from Washington deserves to be heard. Chair would ask members and staff on both sides of the aisle to please take their conversations from the floor, and those who remain to please take their seats. Chair would ask members and staff to please take their seats. Please remove their conversations from the floor. The House will be in order. Members at the rear of the chamber would please take their conversations from the floor. Members and staff would please remove their conversations from the floor and take their seats. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, over the last few months, deadly wildfires, especially in California, Arizona, and Colorado, wildfires in other western states, have highlighted the growing problem with our current federal forest management plans. Like all public lands, our national forests should, unless otherwise designated, be open for multiple use, for everything from recreation to job-creating economic activities. But instead, federal regulations and lawsuits have effectively shut down our national forests. Timber harvests have dropped by 80% over the last 30 years in our national forests. While the Forest Service once received $2 for every $1 spent, it now spends $2 for every $1 it produces. Our federal forests are being badly managed, and there have been devastating consequences to that management. First, rural communities are struggling to survive and no longer have stable funding to pay for vital services. The federal government made a promise over a century ago to actively manage our forests for the benefit of rural schools and communities. Under a federal law passed in 1908, the U.S. Forest Service has historically shared 25% of all timber revenues with rural counties containing national forest land. Since the federal government doesn't pay local taxes, those counties depended on this revenue to help fund essential needs like schools and local infrastructure. But as timber sales declined, Mr. Chairman, so did the revenues to these counties. And counties struggle to find the resources needed to keep teachers in the classroom and police on the streets. Congress provided a short-term solution in 2000 by passing the Secure Rural Schools Act, which continued to provide funding as timber sales decline. SRS was created to provide a transition payments over a 6-year period while these counties diversified their economies. But the fact is, Mr. Chairman, their economies are built on natural resources, in this case timber. With the national debt measuring in the trillions of dollars, it is becoming increasingly difficult to finance this program that costs several $100 million annually, especially when it fails to address the fundamental problem of declining forest management. So a new approach is needed now. The federal government's lack of forest management has cost tens of thousands of American jobs. These forests are the backbone of these communities' economy. From the logging to the mill work to the truck drivers, our forests put thousands of people to work. I should say had put thousands of people to work. Additionally, as I have mentioned, the lack of active forest management has caused a significant degradation of forest health and made them increasingly susceptible to bug infestations and catastrophic wildfires. Mr. Chairman, this is an interesting statistic. Just last year, 9.3 million acres of national forests burned in wildfires. By comparison, only 200,000 acres were harvested by the U.S. Forest Service. That means that 44 times more acres burned compared to those acres that were responsibly harvested. We cannot continue to sit idly by while wildfires rages, homes are destroyed, and lives are lost. H.R. 1526, the Restoring Healthy Forests for Healthy Communities Act, is a long-term solution to put Americans back to work, to restore our forest health, and help prevent catastrophic wildfires by renewing our federal government's commitment to actively manage our national forests. The bill requires responsible timber production on at least half of our federal Forest Service commercial timber lands. And these lands, by the way, Mr. Chairman, were specifically identified by the Forest Service for timber harvest. By helping to restore active forest management, this bill is estimated to create over 200,000 direct jobs and would provide nearly $400 million in savings over 10 years. As required by law in 1908, H.R. 1526 would again share 25% of the revenue from the timber sales with the counties containing this national forest land. The bill will also allow a short-term extension of the Secure Rural Schools payments to provide funding to counties as the Forest Service transitions back into active management. H.R. 1526 would also help prevent deadly and catastrophic wildfires by focusing on hazardous fuels reduction and empowering states to take a more active role in reducing those wildfire risks. Finally, this bill recognizes that states and counties are often better at managing forest lands than the federal government. States have shown that they are able to produce more revenue from timber lands than the federal government. Let me give you an example in my home state of Washington. Washington State is able to harvest 7 times more timber and generate 200 times more revenue on 1/4 of the land compared to what the Forest Service has. They do that by better management. This bill would allow counties to actively manage portions of national forest land through the creation of a community forest demonstration area. H.R. 1526 has broad support. Over 140 local and national organizations, including 68 counties in 17 different states, have endorsed this vital common sense legislation to restore active forest management that will protect American jobs and livelihoods. These communities, their families, and their businesses deserve better than the status quo and the current failure of our forest management plans today. With that, Mr. Chairman, I reserve my time.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon rise?
Yield myself such time as I might consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As someone who represents rural and forested communities that depend upon our national forests, this is an issue I care deeply about, and I know my colleagues on the other side care deeply about this too. We have many common concerns in terms of forest health, in terms of fuel reduction, in terms of dealing with bug infestations and other things. There's, I think, a common interest in finding solutions to better manage our federal forests. Millions of acres are in need of restoration to address disease, bugs, climate change, and fire, which was made painfully clear again this summer. We need a long-term plan to provide for our rural forested counties. Right now, many of these counties are struggling to stay afloat. Counties in my district, for example, are near bankruptcy. Critical county services like public health, education, roads, and most importantly, law enforcement have been slashed to the point where some counties have no rural sheriff's patrols, and prisoners have been let out of jail, prisoners who should not be let out of jail. The federal government made a commitment to these counties 100 years ago. Congress should honor that commitment. I think there are bipartisan ways to honor that commitment. The inclusion of 1 year of county payments at fiscal year 2010 levels, substantially more than those proposed in recent legislation in the Senate, will provide a lifeline to more than 600 forested counties in 41 states. I want to thank the chairman for his hard work on this provision in the bill. Any long-term solution on forest management will require bridge payments to counties. This bill provides a bridge payment. This bill includes an extension of stewardship contracting authority and allows our federal agencies to offer contracts up to 20 years. Stewardship contracts can help reduce the cost of restoration to our forests and to the federal agencies and the U.S. taxpayers to treat large landscapes to prevent catastrophic wildfires we saw in the West this summer and provide predictability to local businesses and industry that incentivizes investment, creates jobs. I met with a gentleman who is going to open a 2.5 megawatt biomass plant in Colorado in November. He's doing that with a 10-year stewardship contract on dead bug kill in the vicinity of his plant. It was done through a collaborative process, and the result is the Forest Service will be able to do fuel reduction on twice as much acreage as if they had to appropriate taxpayer money to do it. And he told me if that was extended to 20 years, which this bill does, that the cost would come down even more. So we will create electricity, make these forests more healthy by utilizing that biomass. And I particularly want to thank the chairman for working with Representative Walden, Representative Schrader, and myself to include our balanced, bipartisan solution for the statutorily unique ONC lands. These lands exist nowhere else in the country. They are historically, statutorily, and geographically unique. The solution we came up with for these unique lands would not be appropriate for other land included in the larger bill. I spent many hours with Representative Walden and Representative Schrader and with you, Mr. Chairman, to work out a reasonable and fair solution to an incredibly complex and long-standing controversy in Western Oregon. I admit it's not a perfect solution. There are things I would change. There are things that Representative Walden would change. There are things that Representative Schrader would change. And, Mr. Chairman, I'm certain there are things that you would have done differently. But that's a legislative process at its best. We did the best we could do and came up with a strong proposal. It's an Oregon solution to an Oregon problem, and I'm pleased to see it included in this legislation. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't have strong concerns about other provisions in the underlying bill. I do. Members should know that H.R. 1526 would dramatically alter the way we manage our national forest system and would threaten the multi-use mission on our public lands. The bill would establish timber production zones in every national forest and more than double timber harvest levels nationwide. In order to meet these targets, federal forest managers would be required to allow logging and road building in current roadless areas and sharply curtail public review of proposed logging projects. The bill would close the courthouse door to citizens concerned about their communities and quality of life in the neighboring forests by requiring plaintiffs to post bonds, a new precedent, in order to challenge federal management decisions. I've had communities in my district litigate against the Forest Service over timber projects that they felt threatened their drinking water supply. I have had the timber industry litigate, as we have had environmental groups. It doesn't mean it's not frustrating, but we can work on streamlining that process without shutting the door to the courthouse, as we did in the HIFRA legislation, a bipartisan bill a number of years ago. This bill would also devolve national forest management currently under the stewardship of the Forest Service to state boards and exempt these areas from major national environmental laws. The practical impact would be to reverse 100 years of national forest management precedent and undermine, or in some cases eliminate, multiple use of our national forests over substantial parts of that forest, harming recreation, hunting, fishing, and tourism. H.R. 1526 represents the largest proposed change to the modern Forest Service since it was created by Gifford Pinchot and Theodore Roosevelt in 1905. I want to reiterate, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Speaker, that Democrats stand ready to work with our colleagues on the other side of the aisle on forest management. There can be, I think there is common ground. There is bipartisan agreement on some issues. Hopefully this bill is the beginning of that conversation, not the end, as we attempt to have a real legislative process with the Senate on these issues. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Oregon reserves. What purpose the gentleman from Washington?
Mr. Chairman, I am very pleased to yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Walden, who, as noted, worked with his two colleagues from Oregon on the uniqueness of the Oregon province. 4 minutes to the gentleman from Oregon. The
gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thanks, Speaker, and I especially thank the Chairman of the House Resources Committee, Doc Hastings, who has been an extraordinary leader not only on our forestry issues, but on allowing us to access America's great energy resources in a responsible way that will create jobs, generate revenue for our country, and be good stewards of our land and water all at the same time. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your work and that of your committee on Restoring Healthy Forests for Healthy Communities Act. Just 2 days ago, Doug Decker, who's the state forester for the state of Oregon, declared that this has been the worst fire season for Oregon since 1951. The state of Oregon alone has already spent $120 million on fire suppression on over 1,000 different fires, and fire season is not over. According to the National Interagency Fire Center, this situation is the same across our forested states and communities. Last year, more than 9 million acres burned, and the federal government spent $2 billion fighting fires. That's billion with a B. And while these federal forests surrounding our local communities are burning, rural families are sentenced to live in poverty as the mills close, the jobs disappear, all because we can't access our great natural resources on federal land. Of the 20 counties that I represent in eastern and southern Oregon, 9 face double-digit unemployment today. 16 have over 14% of their populations living in poverty. 14%. And 14 have over half of their school children eligible for free and reduced lunch programs. Things are so bad in southern Oregon that Josephine County, which is bigger than Rhode Island, lost their last mill a few months ago. And with that closure of that mill, they lost 86 good-paying family wage jobs. A lack of timber revenue has left the county with only 1 patrol deputy And burglary has gone up 49.7%, thefts up 25%, and disorderly conduct's up 17% in 1 year. At a recent roundtable I held in Grants Pass, the sheriff, Gil Gilbertson, told me, and I quote, "I've seen better law enforcement in third world countries than we have in Josephine County," close quote. And remember, the sheriff spent time in law enforcement in Bosnia. He knows that of which he speaks. It's so bad that just a year ago a woman called 911 because her ex-boyfriend was breaking into her home, and he had assaulted her the week before. She was told several times by dispatch that there were no deputies available, and then was told, and I quote, "If he comes inside the residence and assaults you, can you ask him to go away?" The woman was then assaulted and raped. These are real issues for our rural communities today. It's clear the status quo is not working for families in our rural communities. This broken system has to change. Among many positive provisions in this legislation will lead to healthier forests. This bill would require foresters to look at the sustainable yield a forest could provide and then harvest just half of that, and only on land that's suitable for timber harvest. It also limits costly and complex paperwork and requires that it be completed in a timely manner. The bill also contains long overdue provisions for expedited cleanup and salvage. Just like we clean up after floods and tornadoes and hurricanes, isn't it time we cleaned up and replanted and restored after forest fires? This bill also includes legislation that I wrote with my colleagues from Oregon, Representatives DeFazio and Kurt Schrader, on Oregon's unique ONC lands. We have worked through our differences and forged a balanced, common-sense plan that would create or save thousands of forest jobs in Oregon. We would ensure the health of these lands for future generations and provide long-term funding certainty for Oregon's rural schools, roads, and law enforcement agencies that lie within these counties. And it would end the status quo of endless litigation. The plan has broad support in Oregon, from local officials to sheriffs and DAs to business groups and labor unions to newspaper editorial boards. I have here the letters of support and resolutions from 24 counties across Oregon that, with your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to have entered into the record. The Restoring Healthy Forests for Communities and Healthy Communities Act will create prosperous communities and healthy forests. It will provide certainty for teachers and law enforcement officers. It will provide tools to our professional forest stewards to better manage our federal forests, and it's our opportunity to make federal forest policy work for Oregonians and all Americans. I urge its passage.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman's request will be covered under general leave. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I would yield 4 minutes to my colleague from Oregon, Representative Schrader.
The gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank the chairman and ranking member for bringing a bipartisan, actual job-creating piece of legislation to the chamber in these highly divisive times. This is the type of legislation we should be talking about. Rural counties across America, not just in my home state of Oregon, are dying. Unemployment is still in the double digits, as you've heard. Schools are closing, infrastructure is deteriorating, and crime is increasing. There is really no recovery in rural Oregon, rural America. The dwindling amount of county funding from our national forests and secure rural school system has left local governments unable to afford even the basic services that every American should have. They're making our communities unhealthy and unsafe. In Oregon, we currently have 2 counties going bankrupt while we stand idly by. The status quo is no longer acceptable. Moreover, due to the lack of proper active management, our forests are diseased, dying, and overstocked, leaving them susceptible to the catastrophic wildfires we're seeing on TV every night this past summer and fall. This year alone, the U.S. Forest Service has spent over $1 billion fighting forest fires. These wildfires not only burn millions of acres of public and private forest every year, but they cause serious harm to the environment, water, air quality, and to our public health. The Biscuit Fire in Oregon in 2002 alone produced as much as 1/3 of all the carbon released through fossil fuel burning in Oregon annually. That cannot continue. Title III of H.R. 1526 is a bipartisan solution to a unique set of Oregon forest lands that was drafted by myself and my colleagues, Congressman DeFazio and Walden. The Oregon and California Railroad lands, commonly known as the ONC lands, have a unique mandate which differs from other BLM and Forest Service lands that requires them to generate revenue for 18 Oregon counties from a sustainable timber harvest. However, due to tedious and continued litigation, harvest levels are now 90% below what they were in the 90s. No one's asking to go back to the 70s or 80s, folks. That's not the issue, despite what you'll hear. These are lands that are meant to produce timber in a sustainable way. The federal law requires it, actually, and the legislation we wrote does it in an environmentally sound manner. Along with a reliable amount of timber and revenue for our counties, I'd like to remind everyone Title III also designates 90,000 acres of new wilderness protections, 150 miles of wild and scenic rivers. The bill places over 1 million acres of old growth into protection and creates a conservation fund to help take care of it. The underlying bill also extends a lot of the popular forestry programs like stewardship contracting and good neighbor authority. You're going to hear a lot of misinformation about this bill and outright falsehoods. Contrary to what our opponents claim, Title III guarantees ESA and clean water protections that have worked for decades on Oregon's state and private forest lands. It has extensive riparian protections. It restricts pesticide use. Most importantly, it protects our most green and renewable natural resource for generations to come. And it puts certainty back into the woods for our rural communities and job creators. Title III of this job would create over 15,000 direct and indirect jobs by itself. The underlying bill would create over 200,000 jobs nationwide. When folks are still struggling to find jobs and put food on the table, we cannot deny them this opportunity to work. Their families and their communities depend on it. I'm also very encouraged to know Senator Wyden, chairman of the Senate Energy and Natural Resource Committee, is also working on a parallel plan to help fix our broken rural economies and revive our unhealthy forests. We plan to work in a bicameral and bipartisan fashion to come to a final solution that will provide revenue for our counties, clean up our unhealthy forests, and get people back to work in the woods. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Washington.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm very pleased to yield 3 minutes to a member of the Natural Resources Committee, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar.
The gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, thank you, Chairman Hastings, for the time, for your leadership on our committee, and for including my bipartisan wildfire legislation, the Catastrophic Wildfire Prevention Act, in this forest health package. We have a forest health crisis in this country, and this bill will go a long way towards restoring the environment, improving public safety, and putting thousands of people back to work. Due to redistricting, I have represented nearly all of rural Arizona in Congress, nearly 48,000 square miles of U.S. Forest Service land. These areas have been some of the communities most devastated by a recent wildfire. In my first year, the Wallow Fire, now the largest fire in Arizona state history, ravaged 500,000 acres of our treasured Ponderosa pine country in just a few weeks. And this year, our state was struck by the recent loss of 19 firefighters in the Yarnell Hill Fire. That fire was one of many to burn over 103,000 acres this year. We must come together, change the status quo, and facilitate conditions that minimize the chance that fires start and reduce their size, intensity, once they burn. The bill before us today does a few important things to achieve that goal. First, it prioritizes responsible timber production and ensures a reliable revenue stream for local governments. The feds made a promise to our forest communities, and it must uphold that promise. Secure rural school dollars ensure our counties can provide essential services such as public safety and education to our constituents. H.R. 1526 would not only provide certainty in the program, it will increase timber revenues threefold. Secondly, it implements my bill, the Catastrophic Wildfire Prevention Act. These provisions, parts of Title II and Title V of the Act, reduce red tape and provide the land management agencies a variety of tools, specifically stewardship contracting and good neighbor authority, to conduct smaller projects in high-risk areas that need immediate attention. While long-term active forest management will protect our communities in the long run, we have to protect our people and our assets today. These provide an expedited arrangement to streamline thinning and grazing projects needed in immediate at-risk areas like our forest communities, critical water delivery and electrical infrastructures, and our schools. The solutions in our bill are supported by nearly every county in my rural district, in particular Yavapai and Gila County, and many affected stakeholders, including the cattlemen, the Natural Resources Conservation Districts, and the Farm Bureau. This bill has common-sense solutions to our forest health crisis that should garner the entire support of this body. You may look at this bill and think it's not perfect, but it will do a lot to prevent the suffering that communities like the ones I represent have been experiencing. I would welcome any member of this body to come out to my district and meet with the families and that have lost their homes, their fathers, their mothers, husbands and wives, their kids, and their livelihoods. I think you'll see why we have to act. I thank you for your consideration, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Arizona yields back. The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Oregon.
Could I inquire as to how many speakers the gentleman has?
More than you, apparently. I do have several speakers.
I would reserve at this point in time.
The gentleman from Oregon reserves. The gentleman from Washington.
At this time, I'm very pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Colorado, another member of the Natural Resources Committee.
The gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Hastings. I appreciate the opportunity to address emergencies in our forests in the West. Over the past decade, we've seen an increase in the number of catastrophic wildfires burning in the western U.S., resulting in the tragic loss of life, significant property damage, loss of critical habitats, and the pollution of vital watersheds. According to the National Interagency Fire Center, there have been over 38,119 different fires in the United States in 2013 alone. The Black Forest Fire, which ravaged Colorado in June of this year, is believed the most destructive fire in Colorado's history, destroying more than 486 homes with an estimated cost in excess of $85 million. The West Fork Complex Fire burned approximately 110,000 acres in southwest Colorado this summer, and the incident commanders in charge of the suppression efforts on the fire told me that the behavior of the fire was unprecedented. Because of all the beetle bark killed timber, unnaturally dense forests, and dry conditions, the fires acted in a way that defied computer models. Unfortunately, this news was made worse last week in my home state, as Colorado was struck with another natural disaster, in what many believe to be the worst flood in Colorado history. Parts of at least 18 different cities and towns in my home state were severely flooded, and damage to roads, bridges, homes, and other infrastructure is already estimated to exceed $1 billion. While little could have been done to prepare for the staggering rainfall the state received over such a widespread area, in parts of Colorado where fires in recent years stripped the landscape of vegetation, the severity of the flood damage was worsened by intense runoff, erosion, and mudslides. Threats to fire and property resulting from the wildfires are becoming increasingly costly, and by 2030 the number of acres of forest in Colorado that contain residential housing and commercial development is expected to exceed 2 million acres, representing an enormous potential hazard if fuel reduction projects and other proactive managements are not initiated. Instead of ramping up forest management efforts and addressing hazardous conditions of western forests, the Interior Department has proposed a 48% cut agency-wide for hazardous fuel reduction for 2014, and the Forest Service has proposed reducing this proactive management by 24%. In 2012, the Forest Service spent only $296 million on hazardous fuel treatments nationwide, while spending close to $2 billion on wildfire suppression during the same time. It is far more efficient and cost-effective to proactively manage our forests. I've said it before, but the old adage of an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure rings especially true when we're talking about reducing the occurrence and severity of wildfires in our forests. Despite this, we've seen a decrease in the timber harvest of 80% over the past 3 decades. It's no coincidence that during this time the severity of fires and the number of acres burned has increased steadily. From 2000 to 2012, over 90 million acres is burned in the U.S., nearly as many in the previous 3 decades combined. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the time and your support for this and urge passage of this legislation. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I am very pleased to yield 2 minutes to another member of the Natural Resources Committee, a gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On behalf of the communities of the Sierra Nevada, I want to thank Chairman Hastings for this long overdue legislation. If anyone doubts the necessity of this bill, let them come to my district, where the Yosemite Rim fire has just incinerated 400 square miles of our precious forests. For years, foresters had been screaming this warning at us that the excess timber is going to come out of the forest one way or another. It will either be carried out or it will be burned out, but it will come out. In the days when we carried it out, we had healthier forests and a thriving economy. But federal regulations have driven our timber harvest down 80% nationally, more like 90% in the Sierras, and now the timber that we once carried out is being burned out, and there's nothing subtle about the numbers. As the board feet harvested out of these forests has declined, the acreage incinerated by forest fires has increased proportionally and contemporaneously. The human cost has been devastating. Dozens of mills closed, thousands of families out of work, local tax bases eviscerated. Some of the mountain communities in my district now suffer Detroit levels of unemployment. And the environmental cost has been just as devastating. Overcrowded forests, overdrawn watersheds, and now catastrophic fires. And there is nothing more environmentally devastating to a forest than a forest fire. This measure restores the sound forest management practices that we foolishly abandoned to the detriment of our environment and our economy. This bill marks, at long last, a return to common sense for the management of our national forests. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Washington. Gentleman from Oregon.
Mr. Speaker, yield myself such time as I might consume.
Without objection.
Speaker, I'd like to spend a little bit of time directly addressing the concerns and questions of some constituents back in Oregon regarding the O&C plan in this bill. As Representative Schrader said, there is an extraordinary amount of disinformation and obfuscation out there. This is a bottom plan. It provides everyone at the table with something that they don't currently have. For failing counties in western Oregon, and Representative Schrader did a great job talking about that, as did Representative Walden, it means $1 billion, $1 billion over 10 years to help pay for basic government services like law enforcement, public health, and education. It means putting sheriffs back on our roads, keeping violent criminals behind bars, having better public health, and rebuilding our infrastructure. All of those things are good jobs, necessary jobs, and things that enhance the quality of life for Oregonians and all Americans. For forested communities and local economies, this plan means sustaining or creating thousands of good-paying jobs. I have counties that have chronic unemployment in the double digits. I've taken to telling some people, I represent the new Appalachia. When you go and visit these depressed communities, when the last mill closes in one of my counties, and I talked to the owners of the mill, and they said, if your bill had passed, we'd be hiring 100 people instead of firing 100 people in a community where 100 would be the largest employer. This means keeping those mills open, or maybe adding shifts. This plan will keep the raw logs here at home, rather than exporting our timber to places like China. Now, for the environmental community, many of whom have totally disregarded or created propaganda about this bill, it means the first ever legislative protection for mature and old-growth forests in western Oregon. Let me repeat that. First ever legislative protection. They are not legislatively protected now. In fact, if the Clinton Forest Plan, the Northwest Forest Plan, is ordered fully implemented in pending litigation in a court here in D.C., that old growth will be some of the first to be harvested. Now, since I've come to Congress, I've been attempting to preserve the old growth. This would do it. 1.2 million acres of old growth preserved. Habitat that's fabulous. It's a carbon sink. It has the best areas to recreate. The bill also increases wilderness protection on the O&C lands by 250%, doubling the size of the rogue wilderness, adding Devil's Staircase, and it also will add 130 miles of wild and scenic designation. More river protection, on the ONC lands in one plan than in the previous 50 years combined. And we will quadruple the watershed protection compared to Oregon state standards. They keep saying this is Oregon, this is just the way Oregon private forestry is done. No, we're going to have 4 times the riparian protection. And in terms of herbicides and pesticides, we're going to require the development of an integrated pest management plan through a public process for these lands. This is not Oregon forest practices as we know it and as they are picturing in ads. If they have concerns about Oregon forest practices, they ought to go to their governor and state legislature, because this bill is not that. Now, of the 2.8 million acres, 1.2 million acres of old growth will be preserved. 300,000 acres of additional riparian preserved to protect our water quality for consumption and for fisheries and other values. 1.3 million, less than half, will be managed. Less than half will be managed. Areas that have been previously managed, many of which need thinning, and they need restoration work. And half of those 1.3 million managed will be managed on a rotation of over 100 years, providing, again, tremendous environmental benefits. Here's what the plan doesn't do. It doesn't privatize or sell any federal lands. In fact, these lands will remain in federal ownership, and we will pay the federal government $10 million a year to manage these lands, and the federal government will save tens of millions of dollars every year because of the management being done by a board which would be appointed by our governor and would actually govern these forests and manage these forests through an open public process under the Oregon Open Meetings Law. It will not return to the unsustainable levels that occurred during the watch of my predecessor, 1.6 billion board feet the year I ran for Congress on these lands. That was not sustainable. And they would tell people we're going back to that. No, we're not. I ran against that, and we're not going back there. It looks like the best estimates are we would probably get to about 1/3 of the level, 1/3 of that level on these lands, environmentally responsible plan. It does not eliminate national environmental laws. They would still apply. This plan is about trying to restore balance and predictability to Western Oregon. I was pretty surprised at the statement, better known as a SAP, that claimed this proposal would create more legal uncertainty. I don't know how it's possible to create more legal uncertainty on the ONC lands. The BLM is in the current of a multi-year, multi-million-dollar process to rewrite the management plan for these lands. The new plan is intended to replace the old plan, which resulted from a lawsuit. The old plan was litigated and withdrawn. Their new plan was withdrawn by this administration because they said they couldn't defend it in a lawsuit. Now they're developing yet another new plan at the cost of tens of millions of dollars, which will certainly be litigated. And just recently, a decision in federal court has confirmed that the ONC Act means what it says: permanent, sustainable timber production. This decision throws the status quo further into an uncertain area. Now the BLM is required to offer for sale the allowable sale quantity every year. It hasn't been doing that. There's another lawsuit that would make this decision retroactive. That would be over 1 billion board feet of timber. And yet another lawsuit pending seeks to return the ONC logging levels to the 1970s and 80s. This says nothing of pending lawsuits on individual timber sales. That's not certainty, that's chaos. I'm pushing a balanced ONC plan that does 3 things: provides predictable payments to failing counties, creates jobs, and sustain the existing infrastructure, and legislatively protects the environment and public health. This is the beginning and the first beginning on either side of Capitol Hill of a long legislative process, the first step toward getting a bipartisan bill finally negotiated and sent to the President sometime, hopefully not too distant from now. With that, I would reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserved. Gentleman from Washington.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I am very pleased to yield 2 minutes to another member of the Natural Resources Committee, the gentlelady from Wyoming, Mrs. Lummis.
Gentlelady is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of the Act because it'll save forests in Wyoming and the West. These are fabulous natural resources enjoyed by people and wildlife, but across the West they are burning or dying after decades of federal mismanagement. This photograph is from the Black Hills National Forest. Now, right here, you see a very lush green area in the forest. Adjacent to that, you have brown areas with dead or dying trees that have been ravaged by the mountain pine beetle, where you find that healthy wildlife habitat, that healthy soil that's resistant to erosion, the healthy rivers and streams, the safe area to camp and hike and recreate, is because you have a healthy forest that was actively managed. This green area was logged. It was thinned. The thinning is selective, it's measured and designed to maintain a healthy and strong mix of trees. The brown area wasn't thinned. Bureaucratic delays, litigation, and endless appeals prevented conservation logging in this area. When you don't manage a forest, the entire ecosystem suffers, from the trees down to the wildlife, the soil, and the streams. It's dangerous to camp or hike in the brown area because of the dead or falling trees. The dead trees are now fuel for fires, and we've seen them all over the West in the last 3 years, including this summer. This picture is replicated throughout the West. Dead or burning federal forests right next to healthy state or tribal forests because the state and tribal forests are actively managed. Our forests don't have to look like this. They can look like this. This act will get the Forest Service back to work on conservation logging, create jobs in the forest products industry, create revenue for federal and local governments, and prevent the astronomical cost of responding to wildfires and infestations. It also gives state and local government a voice in forest management within their borders. Through Good Neighbor Authority and community forest demonstration areas, we're involving the people who actually live near those forests, who depend on that beautiful place to live. Mr. Speaker, this is one of the most common sense bills I've had the privilege of helping with. I urge its passage, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Washington reserves. Gentleman from Oregon.
I'd reserve this point.
Gentleman from Oregon reserves. Gentleman from Washington.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm very pleased to yield 2 minutes to another member of the Natural Resources Committee, the gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Labrador.
Gentleman from Idaho is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I rise today in support of H.R. 1526. I want to thank Chairman Hastings and the ranking member for all their work that they have done on this bill. And today I specifically rise in support of Title IV of H.R. 1526, which I originally introduced as H.R. 1294, the Self-Sufficient Community Lands Act. Thank you, Mr. Chairman Hastings, for recognizing the importance of this issue and including it in your bill. In Idaho and much of the West, the economies of rural communities once relied upon the timber industry for job creation and tax revenues. Over the last several decades, extreme environmentalists have hindered the ability to develop timber from our public lands through litigation. In fact, timber harvests have declined more than 80% over the last 30 years. Counties that were once dependent upon timber receipts to fund schools, roads, and daily operations find themselves desolate and broke. In 2000, when the federal government operated with a budget surplus, and in order to compensate for the decline in timber receipts, as everybody knows, Congress passed the Secure Rural Schools and Community Self-Determination Act. These payments were supposed to be phased out over time to allow counties to diversify their local economies. However, last year alone, 35 of Idaho's 44 counties received SRS payments, totaling over $26 million. While Congress has continually reauthorized this funding, we are still fighting the same issues about multiple use on public land while leaving our counties in limbo. To solve this problem, I introduced H.R. 1294.
This legislation empowers counties to generate much-needed revenue by turning over management of federal forests to local and state officials who are best equipped to make these important management decisions rather than bureaucrats in Washington. It is time to permanently provide our counties with a solution which would create jobs, generate tax receipts for the counties, and improve forest health. In a time of record receipts and record deficits, it is time that we stop kicking the can down the road, start working toward a solution. Our country continues to spend billions.
I yield the gentleman additional 30 seconds.
Gentleman's additional 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our country continues to spend billions of dollars on this program instead of fixing the problem. Traditional rural timber communities have been operating in an environment of uncertainty for decades, and many public lands in western states have been inaccessible due to federal policies and litigation. It is time we find a long-term solution to help our counties. I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 1526, and Mr. Chairman, I yield the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Washington reserves. Gentleman from Oregon.
I'll wait.
Gentleman from Oregon reserves. Gentleman from Washington.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to yield 1 minute now to, I have to say, former member of the Natural Resources Committee, but a valuable member then, Mr. Pierce from New Mexico.
Gentleman from New Mexico is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to speak on this bipartisan bill that brings common sense management back to our forest. Since Tom Tidwell took over the forest, he said that he would like to reintroduce fire into the wild. Well, he's done that. This year, almost 10 million acres, more than twice the size of New Jersey. In the years since 2009 when he took over, larger than Ohio, 27 million acres have burned in our national forests. Instead, this bill creates jobs in places like Cibola County in New Mexico, where Matt Allen used to have a thriving mill, but now then survives on cutting 1x4 timber, 1x4 boards out of the logs he's able to take out of the forest. Our streams are choked with mud. Habitat is devastated. A 75-foot deep lake near Ruidoso, New Mexico, that provides drinking water to the city of Alamogordo has 50 feet of fill in that 70-foot lake. Our fish are dead. The streams are dead, choked with mud, because the head of the U.S. Forest Service says let it burn instead of cut it. Common sense says cut it. This bill ensures that. We yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Washington reserves. Gentleman from Oregon.
So Mr. Chairman, I want to advise my friend that I have no more speakers, and I'm prepared to close. The gentleman is prepared to close.
I'm prepared to close.
The gentleman from Oregon.
Yield myself such time as I may consume.
No objection.
As I stated earlier, this is an imperfect vehicle. I have major concerns about 3 of the titles in this bill. But this is the beginning of a legislative process. That's something that's become pretty rare here in Washington, D.C. We put something forward. We send it to the Senate. The Senate takes up that or similar legislation. We go to a conference committee. We work things out, and we solve problems. It was that for most of the first 25 years I was here. That's a rare thing these days. This holds promise to enter into a real legislative process, a real beginning. Now, if we fail to act, we just reinforce the status quo. And I got to tell you, the status quo is totally unacceptable. There are some who would prefer that. They think they win with the current paralysis. Well, if you want permanent protection of our old growth, if you want additional wilderness on the Rogue River, and if you want the Devil's Staircase wilderness, and you want better forest health, the status quo won't get you there. If that's what you really care about, it won't get you there. Now, my counties can't wait. The status quo, I have 2 counties who are experimenting essentially with how does a county go bankrupt. Something has never happened before and isn't provided before in Oregon statute, and I have others who are not too far behind. In my rural communities, in desperate need of real jobs, they can't wait either. So we cannot fail to act. We move forward tonight or tomorrow with a vote, and then it will be time for the Senate to come up with its version. Then we can go to a conference committee, we can work out final legislation, and take it to the President. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman from Oregon yields back. The gentleman from Washington.
How much time do I have, Mr. Chairman?
The gentleman has 5.5 minutes.
I yield myself the balance of the time.
Without objection.
First of all, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank Chairman Lucas of the Agriculture Committee for his cooperation in expediting this bill to the floor. We have memorialized our agreement in an exchange of letters. And I want to thank the ranking member because I think in his closing remarks he made exactly the right statement. And that is that we in the House will have our position. The Senate is obligated to do the same, and it may be entirely different, and that's fine, but we'll work out the differences. And I also want to thank the ranking member and his two colleagues for Oregon because I understand the uniqueness of what they are looking for, and frankly their approach to their uniqueness was very similar to what I and others were thinking should be applied elsewhere, and so that's what is embodied in this bill. But I want to just make one point here because sometimes we lose sight of this fact. What is multiple use in timber, when we talk about timber? Multiple use means, from a commercial standpoint, of thinning and harvesting the timber. Where we get caught up in the differences is we look at timber entirely different than any other crop. I represent a very diversified agriculture area in central Washington, and the crops are on a yearly basis, and it's as diverse as apples to wheat. But when farmers plant these crops, then they use various chemicals at various times of the year in order to manage whatever may happen so that they can harvest a good crop at the end of the year. Well, timber is exactly the same, except depending on the type of timber, the harvest period is from 30 to 40 years. But if you have a problem with pine beetles, as we've had throughout the West, and this is a crop in a multiple use area, you ought to manage that. You manage that by using the chemicals that are available. So the only difference when we talk about managing timber from a one-year management of yearly crops is the time span. But it should be managed in a responsible way in that regard. And that's what we provide for in this bill, is set targets and properly manage. So I think this is a good bill. I certainly hope that my colleagues will support this when we have the vote tomorrow so we can continue the process of negotiating with the Senate when they hopefully pass a bill. And also with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to present some letters and resolutions in support for the record under my name. And with that, I will yield back my time.
Without objection, and the gentleman. All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. In lieu of the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Natural Resources, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee, print 113-21, modified by the amendment printed in Part B of House Report 113-215, is adopted. The bill as amended shall be considered as the original bill for the purpose of further amendment under the 5-minute rule and shall be considered as read. No further amendment to the bill as amended shall be in order except those printed in Part C of House Report 113-215. Each such further amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report. A member designated in the report shall be considered read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and the opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 1, printed in Part C of House Report 113-215. For what purpose does the gentleman from Montana seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 1, printed in Part C of House Report Number 113-215, offered by Mr. Daines of Montana.
Pursuant to House Resolution 351, the gentleman